Aloha, inspired moneymakers. Welcome to Inspired Money, the show where we strive to do more with our money. We want to make more, give more, and live more. What good is money if we cannot enjoy it or have a positive impact? Today, we're talking about investing in sustainable and ethical companies. Global investors are increasingly focused on ESG issues in their investment strategies. I saw a figure, roughly 89% of investors considered ESG issues in some form as part of their investment approach in 2022. That's up 84% in 2021, according to a Capital Group study. While the pandemic seemed to bring ESG issues into focus, there is controversy as to whether capitalism and social measures can coexist together peacefully. I know that I want to learn more about investing in sustainable and ethical companies. Some of my clients do too. So we've assembled a fantastic panel of guests this evening. Let's welcome them in. I'll start with Carole Laible. Carole is CEO of Domini Impact Investments. She boasts over 2 decades of experience in impact investing. She's responsible for research, operations, and marketing, and she collaborates closely with Chair Amy Domini, spearheading initiatives like the Domini Forest Project in advocating for fossil fuel divestment while championing diversity and finance as a global angel member of 100 Women in Finance. Welcome, Carole. I'm so glad that we got through your tech difficulties and that you made it. Oh, you're muted.
Say, you would think after all these years of video, we'd get used to it. Thank you. Thank you for having me today.
Yes, hopefully I will unmute myself correctly this evening. I'm also struggling. Morgan Simon, welcome. She's a leading voice in impact investing, having influenced over $150 billion in funds. Her experience is widely sought after, highlighted by her acclaimed book, Real Impact, The New Economics of Social Change, which has garnered attention from Harvard Business School to the United Nations. As the founding partner of Candid Group, a registered investment advisor, she actively invests while championing her vision of a more equitable financial landscape. Welcome, Morgan. I have to say, I read your bio, and 2 things really stood out to me. Your dad was in Sha Na Na, and your mom worked with Michael Milken?
I'm very much kind of 50-50 between them. But yes, my father was the pianist for 53 years for Sha Na Na, and I think really taught me a lot about, even in the context of social change, about really creating the party and the movement that people want to be part of, right? Of the degree which we try to really have entertainment as part of what we do. And then my mother was the president and CEO of Knowledge Universe, which was Mike Milken's education investment arm. And I think from her, got to really learn a lot of the ropes in terms of investment professionalism, evaluating companies, and really balancing that social environmental impact. So that was part of, Beyond in general. I started out in impact investing quite young, filing my first shareholder resolution as a college student. But beyond that, really benefited from having a family full of interesting backgrounds and experiences to draw from.
That sounds like an interesting dinner table to grow up at. Our next panelist, we have Michael H. Posner, the Jerome Kohlberg Professor of Ethics and Finance at NYU Stern School of Business. He's renowned for his dedication to advancing human rights. As director of the Center for Business and Human Rights, he champions corporate accountability and social justice. With extensive experience in government, academia, and advocacy, Posner is a leading authority on global human rights issues, having played pivotal roles in shaping policies on torture prevention, refugee protection, and corporate responsibility. Welcome, Michael, from Belfast, where it is getting later at night.
Thanks. It's great to be here and be part of this conversation.
I'm so glad that you could make it. I really appreciate it. We're going to have one more panelist coming in later, but first, let's jump right in and go to segment 1. In sustainable investing, regulatory bodies are pivotal. They set the stage for standardization, transparency, and accountability, crucial in the burgeoning ESG, environmental, social, and governance sector. Their mission? Crafting regulatory frameworks and policies that shape sustainable investment practices. This involves defining ESG standards and ensuring that companies meet these criteria, a significant step in promoting ethical and sustainable business practices. A critical role they play is in combating greenwashing. By enforcing stringent standards, they ensure the company's sustainability claims are genuine, fostering trust and credibility in the sector. However, challenges abound. A significant one is the lack of uniform ESG measurement standards, a gap these bodies tirelessly work to bridge, striving for harmonization and adaptability. Their impact is undeniably profound. The rise in global sustainable investment, now exceeding $30 trillion, underscores their essential role in sculpting a sustainable financial future. They're the guardians of ethical investment, guiding us towards a greener, more responsible economy. Mike, you wrote an opinion piece after the World Economic Forum in Davos. How can we make ESG investing real and meaningful?
Yeah, so I think we're in an interesting moment now because, especially here in Europe, governments are, especially through the European Union, beginning to look at a serious way of regulating global supply chains, technology companies, and the like. It goes by the name mandatory due diligence, and the European Union is about to finalize a requirement that will mean that all 27 member states need to set national laws. We're moving from a kind of voluntary system to a regulatory system. And again, especially in Europe, but the European model is going to basically come to dominate the world because so many American companies and others do business there. So I think it's a good thing. I don't think they quite know exactly what they're doing or how to do it, but it's going to change the discussion of ESG, which in my judgment has been too soft, especially on the S. It's going to make it real.
So a net positive, hopefully.
Yeah, I think absolutely. We have a long way to go. I think the Germans last year introduced a global supply chain law, and they recognize now that they've got to look at each industry. Each industry is different, but they've got to come up with standards and metrics, ways to evaluate performance, and then create some accountability. That's not going to happen overnight, but I think that we're clearly moving in a direction where companies are going to be under a lot more scrutiny in terms of how they actually carry out their social responsibilities, especially with regard to global supply chains.
Morgan, in your experience, what advice would you give to regulatory bodies to more effectively engage with and support impact investors in creating systemic change?
I'll note that in my work with Candid Group, we are generally working with accredited investors, and we, are working with family foundations who want their money working for justice, who are working across asset classes, and in general are sophisticated investors. And that the classic kind of accredited investor definition is that you have the sophistication to make great decisions for yourself. And I think that's where really allowing people to express their values, that it's almost as if the government were to come in and say, we think red doesn't look good on you. We're going to prohibit you from buying red clothing. It just is a pretty American thing to do in terms of context of personal choice. So I also want to be clear that everyday investors can also make sophisticated choices, right? This is not just about accredited versus non-accredited investors. But I think the idea that our dollar is our vote that we make every day. And that's whether I'm buying, the organic milk or the normal milk, or do I go all the way to the farmer's market? We get to make these decisions for ourselves because we're always kind of evaluating a basket of values in terms of what we're trying to achieve with our dollars. And it's that this is this vote that you get to make every day, as opposed to every 4 years of where am I spending my dollars? Where am I investing my dollars? and that we should have the ability to make those choices for ourselves, and that we also should, even as governing bodies, when I think about state pension funds or otherwise, that we are holistically trying to support the future of people. And that if you have great retirement savings but nowhere to breathe, that's not going to serve you very well, right? So really trying to think holistically about what are we trying to achieve, and also all the different ways that environment, social governance factors really enhance returns. So I think those twin elements to it of sometimes I think lately we've been throwing the baby out with the bathwater and ignoring the fact that you tend to have the opportunity to get outsized performance in the context of ESG. Be clear, I'm not offering any investment advice here. And at the same time, people need the ability to express their values in the way that makes sense to them. So I think that's the balance point we have to strike.
Carole, in the context of the clients that you serve, I know that greenwashing comes up a lot. What specific measures would you recommend to regulatory bodies that they implement to ensure that sustainability claims are both genuine and impactful?
Well, thank you, Andy. I think our journey here is not unlike the journey that investors were first faced with when we were determining financial rules, right? Back prior to regulation around financial reporting, there was a lot of conversation about it couldn't be done, it would be expensive to do, it wouldn't be consistent. And yet we found a way to do it with financial reporting. And I think it's going to be the same with sustainable disclosures, environmental and social data. We're certainly seeing that underway. And a lot of that is driven by demand. So, providing investors and stakeholders better information so they can better understand a company's plans and activities and how this company is positioned for the future is certainly a helpful tool to investors. It's a helpful tool to all the stakeholders of that company, their suppliers, their customers, their employees. And this increased disclosure, helps to improve that information landscape, and strengthen our ability to evaluate climate strategies, or as Michael, was talking about the social piece of a company's performance. So thinking about, their workforce disclosure. So I think we're seeing this global push, this global harmonization and increasing expectations across all stakeholders for these disclosures. At Domini, we help to support that by submitting public comments where we can, when regulation is proposed, supporting, that decision useful information, increased disclosure on things that we consider to be material to investing. So, there are several SEC proposals out there related to climate disclosure. But we also have one on what's called human capital management disclosure. So things really tied to a company's workforce. Simple, you would think disclosure that's relatively straightforward. The number of employees, what's the total cost of the workforce, the turnover and workforce stability measures, and workforce demographic data. So how they can attract and retain diverse talent. All of those things are meaningful to investors in helping to select, build better portfolios, select better companies, but also help us to align those portfolios with our investors seeking. We say, that triple bottom line, so seeking competitive financial returns alongside of universal human dignity and ecological sustainability, or more simply stated, triple P, people, planet, and profit. So I think, regulation will help strengthen the ESG data and disclosure. We're certainly excited with some of the proposals that we see coming out and are hopeful that it will have real impact.
Yeah, it sounds like the regulatory environment will constantly be evolving. And as investors, we need to pay attention and understand what that means to our underlying investments. Let's move to segment 2.
In today's market, sustainability is not just a preference, it's a driving force. Consumers are increasingly making choices based on environmental impact, reshaping how businesses operate. This shift is more than ethical, it's economically savvy. Companies aligning with sustainable practices are finding it profitable as eco-conscious decisions resonate with customers. Globally, a significant eco-awareness is emerging, especially in developing regions. This rise in environmental consciousness is compelling companies to prioritize green strategies and transparent practices. To catalyze this shift, businesses are adopting techniques to guide customers towards sustainable choices, creating a market where eco-friendliness is the norm. This strategy benefits society and shareholders alike, proving that sustainability can coexist with profitability. We're at a tipping point in consumer behavior, steering the direction of sustainable investing. As more individuals choose eco-friendly options, companies are responding, fostering a cycle of sustainability that's redefining consumerism and investment strategies. This emerging trend signals a new era in the marketplace.
Morgan, how has the Candid Group leveraged consumer behavior trends to drive investments in social justice? And maybe can you provide an example of a successful investment influenced by these trends?
Sure. I think 2 elements. Gosh, there's so many. And I think that's part of what's exciting in the context of moving into this space, of people being so much more conscious of any number of consumer choices that they're making. So whether that's in food systems, the environment, within racial equity and inclusion, so many different ways that we're able to express values through investment. And with that, I think we're also thinking a lot more definitively about who gets to decide what social change is. And that often it can't just be people with wealth, right? Particularly if we're talking about poverty alleviation, whether in the US or elsewhere, how do we design structures that really shift decision making so that we're not making decisions about other people's lives? So we have 2 debt funds within Candid Group, one called Olamina that's focused on US community development, and another called Afterglow that's a climate justice fund. And in both cases, we have community advisory boards, which are community members and activists who really have that in-depth lived experience, who get to help determine the pipeline, who have final veto power over investments in some cases, and are really able to ensure that if projects are going to be impacting their communities, that it's going to be in a positive way. And that one of the things with impact investing, the Merriam-Webster definition of impact is just to impinge upon, especially forcefully, and that could be good or bad, right? And that's where we need to make sure, I think the same as you're seeing the consumer trend of people becoming conscious consumers, it's not enough to just see an ESG label slapped on a product. And we've actually seen, I think thoughtful regulatory action from that perspective of you actually do have to show that you are improving the lives of people and the environment if you're going to call something an ESG product, and that we all need to be conscious consumers to make sure that's real. Now, we would say that that's real if the people who are impacted actually got a vote, right? The idea of nothing about us without us, as opposed to external people always getting to make those decisions. So that's something within our investments that I think we're very conscious of.
Mike, in your experience, what role does consumer advocacy play in shaping corporate behavior towards sustainability?
Well, I think it's growing. It's especially been had an impact on the environment. There's no question that the E in ESG has been developed quite significantly over the last 20 years. I think it's much less so on the social side. And that's really where I think that's where our energy is going. And we need to see also in situations where environmental and social issues come into conflict, we need to deal with those issues. Your video had two images, one of an electric car, the Tesla. Inside the Tesla is a battery. The battery is fueled in part by cobalt, which keeps it from burning up. The cobalt's mined in the Congo, and there are 25,000 kids working in those mines. So I'm all in favor of the move to electric vehicles. It's essential. Our environment is threatened. But we need to be aware of the underlying elements that make that battery work, that make that car work. The other image was of solar panels. Solar panels are manufactured overwhelmingly in China. And an important component part, the polysilicon wafers and ingots are manufactured 98% in Xinjiang, in China, part of China, where Uyghurs are subject to forced labor. I want solar panels coming into the United States and around the world. They're a good part of a smart investment strategy on environment. But we have to be aware of and think about what are the ways to begin to wean ourselves of that situation and not be actually contributing to forced labor in that situation.
Do you think that the social is lagging environmental because it's more difficult to measure on the corporate side, or is it just a matter of focus and time?
I think it's more difficult to measure, it's riskier, and it's more expensive. So I think if the notion is, if we start to look at, ESG measures are essentially looking at risks to investors. There are costs to doing the kinds of things that I'm talking about. If you formalize those informal ASM, so-called ASM mines in the Congo, there's a cost associated with that. If you begin to look at and really develop data about workers in, let's say, a global supply chain for manufacturing or farming, inevitably you're going to find out that people aren't being paid enough or they're working in substandard conditions. And that's going to cost the companies money to fix. And so I think part of it is it's harder to measure. Part of it is that it's more expensive. And it flies in the face of a notion of return on investment in the next quarter. You just can't make the case as easily.
I want to welcome in our fourth panelist, the Reverend Kirsten Snow Spalding. She's a multifaceted leader serving as vice president of the Ceres Investor Network at the sustainability nonprofit Ceres, with a background spanning government, labor activism, law, and academia. Kirsten brings extensive experience to her role, complemented by her education as an Episcopal priest, a wife, and a mother of two. Welcome, Reverend.
Delighted to be with you all and fascinated by this conversation. Thank you, Michael, for your comments. I'm
so glad that you could join us and make it. I'm wondering, maybe you can share with us the Ceres Investor Network and the institutions that make up that group. How do you see a connection between consumer behavior and the way that the members are investing today?
It's a really good question. So I work with large institutional investors. My network is a mix. We're about 220 some investors now. We range from socially responsible investors who have a long history and looking for impact and basing their investment strategy on their values, to really large multi-asset class managers. You'll know the names: BlackRock, State Street, big asset managers who invest in everything in the market. And they're joining our network because they're interested in trying to address sustainability risks and look for opportunities in the new economy that's coming. So they have some products that are dedicated to values or impact, but they also are thinking about their entire portfolio and recognizing that some of the issues that we care about are really material to the investments that they're making. They're financially material: climate change, biodiversity loss, water, human rights, communities and the impact on communities of environmental and other sustainability problems. Those things really matter to these big investors. I also have pension funds and endowments and foundations, but they've all come into the network to work on a range of sustainability issues. Andy, your question about how does consumer interest impact the investment strategy? When an investor is thinking about what they want to invest in, they want to be ahead of the curve. That's how they're going to make money for their beneficiaries or their clients. So they're looking very carefully at where's the economy going? What are consumers looking for? They want to be in the products and services. They want to be resonating the themes just a little bit ahead of the market. That's how they're going to make money. And they want to be addressing things that are really going to be risks to their portfolio in the long run. So what we know is that consumers are demanding more green products, that there's no room in the market now for things that ignore sustainability from an environmental perspective. We know that there's a rising concern about income inequality, poverty, particularly in the global south, the ways that the developing world has not really allowed the emerging markets to grow and really get what they need to thrive, and that we're all interconnected. Especially young people really hold this as a high priority. And so investors are really thinking about what sectors, what companies, what investments are going to put them in a position to build on that consumer demand, I guess. Yeah.
Carole, can you speak?
Maybe I'll just give one example because you were talking about EVs when I jumped in. So investors are engaging with Ford and GM and Toyota. And they're saying to those companies, look, you got to get ahead of this electric vehicle trend. You can't just continue to build Hummers. You can't build these huge energy guzzling, fuel guzzling vehicles, because that's not where the consumers are going to go. So if you're going to be a leader in the new economy that's coming, you've got to start shifting your product. And that's really important to the investors because they want those companies to thrive.
Thanks for the example. Carole, can you speak to, like, if investors are interested in investing, supporting ESG, looking at a mutual fund versus an ETF, can you give us some context? Like, where does one start?
Well, we like to say, especially when you're dealing with impact investing products, there are tools in the toolkit that can be put to work to align your investments, to harness the power of your savings to help build a better future and a better world for all. But you really have to peel back the layers and take a look. So we'd like to put it in this toolbox of 3 tools that can be put to work so that as an investor is approaching a product, they can think about which of those tools are being put to work. So the first tool is a lot of what we've been talking about. It's using environmental and social standards in the investment process. So that's the need for disclosure. That's how we make choices with the information. And we put that under the umbrella of being better investors. So that's the first tool, is using that information, using those standards to make an investment choice. The second tool that we have is, once we're an investor, we have a seat at the table. We have a voice, and that's a very differentiated voice. And companies often care about that voice and will really engage and participate and listen to that input. And that can really create another level of impact, a deeper level of impact, by creating positive change where we see weakness. And we put that under the umbrella of being better owners. And then the third tool is investing in communities. We've heard a lot about income inequality, poverty alleviation. And sometimes when you're talking with investors, they're a little confused on that. It's sort of, well, how does that play into my, investment thesis? Well, we believe that all investments sit on a foundation of fairness and justice for all. So if there's disruption in that system through inequality, that will not be good for an investment portfolio. And we put that under the tool of being better neighbors. So as an investor is approaching, whether it's a mutual fund or an ETF, focusing on those three tools of being a better investor, being a better owner, and being a better neighbor. And how much is that manager putting each of those tools to work, I think will really help them to make that decision. In that context, you also want to look at history and experience, and you want to look at disclosure. So at Domini, we think, we don't just talk about our environmental and social standards, but we lay them out. We put them on our website. You can download them as a PDF. You can read through all 60 pages, and you can see what we mean when we say we're researching these environmental and social issues and how corporates stack up on that. So, just to kind of, wrap that up, every dollar that goes out to the world has impact. An investor gets to choose how they're going to channel that impact. It can be positive, it can be negative, but it's not only investors, it's investors, it's consumers, as we talked about. We see sort of this, a lot of investors leaning towards green choices. So there is a bit of work. I don't think it's overwhelming, but in the same way, you spend some time thinking about who's managing your money and what the financial returns look like when it comes to sustainable investing. Those considerations. I think those three tools help guide that.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that framework. Let's move to segment 3.
In sustainable investing, tax incentives and financial benefits are key motivators. Governments are offering tax credits and grants to businesses embracing environmental, social, and governance practices. This shift not only promotes eco-friendliness, but also enhances a company's financial health. Businesses can reduce tax liabilities through sustainability credits, making green investments more viable. ESG tax incentives encourage private companies to adopt sustainable practices affordably. The availability of grants and subsidies supports this green movement. Sustainable practices also lead to direct economic benefits like lower utility bills. Businesses earning and selling emission reduction credits, ERCs, turn eco-efforts into profitable ventures. Consumer trends toward climate-conscious choices are growing. Companies with sustainable practices are increasingly favored by these consumers. This creates a cycle where environmental responsibility and profitability are intertwined. Companies adopting these changes contribute to environmental conservation and benefit from financial incentives and consumer support.
Carole, what are your thoughts on the balance between government incentives and intrinsic corporate responsibility in achieving sustainability goals?
I think incentives are exactly that. I think government incentives really help to promote things like clean transportation, efficient heating and cooling, but also encourages companies to take action on setting targets. So I think the incentives and the rebates are helpful, coupled with the regulation is going to be very positive. We've seen a lot of that movement here in the US. The Inflation Reduction Act, $373 billion in federal clean energy and production incentives is certainly going to have an impact and help to mitigate climate change, while at the same time being responsible for the creation of over 170,000 jobs. We also had the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which will help to build infrastructure needed for the electric vehicles that we're hoping are going to be on the road and get purchased, as well as retrofitting for clean energy. So, we see some of those solar panel manufacturing companies that we were discussing early now starting to move some of that manufacturing here to the US. So for solar, they make solar panels as well as Enphase and Flex, which create the microinverters for the solar panels, are now at work creating production facilities here in the United States thanks to that infrastructure investment. So we see it at work. I mean, I'm sure we've seen it across the globe as well. We also see some companies then passing that on to consumers as a way to inspire further spending and further boosting those sustainable practices. So, for example, Con Ed is passing some of the rebates on to their customers to encourage installing solar panels or heat pumps or electric charging. So love the word incentive. I think it works. Everybody likes to feel like they're getting a little bit of support to move that infrastructure in the right direction.
Yeah.
Right.
If I could jump in, just talking to the investors in my network, we see the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, the Infrastructure and Jobs Act, as just a massive public policy shift that is making it feasible to really do this transition away from fossil fuels and shift to abundant, reliable, affordable, clean energy. It's an industrial policy, and it's really impacting investors, because now investors can move money into these kinds of projects. So we're seeing big investors like Macquarie, global investor that focuses on infrastructure. Instead of building more of the traditional fossil fuel infrastructure, they can move their money into the clean energy infrastructure and know that these incentives are going to support their dollars. So the bottom line becomes readily accessible. They make their money back faster. And with the companies also getting the incentives, they're sure that there's going to be uptake on the infrastructure. So that's just one example. But I would say, these couple of policies, these incentives, the tax benefits, but also there are loans and loan guarantees. All of them are making private investment more viable. And we're seeing it really accelerate the move into these kinds of companies and projects. Project finance is a very specialized area, but we're not going to see all of this infrastructure built by government alone. It's going to take partnerships with private investors and companies and government. And this is really good news from our perspective.
Mike, from your perspective, how effective are green tax incentives and rebates in encouraging businesses to adopt sustainable practices?
Well, I agree with both what Carole and Kirsten have said. The Inflation Reduction Act is an extraordinary incentive. In fact, we see German and French companies coming into the United States to take advantage of the tax benefits. The one thing I would just add is I would like to see a little more flexibility in terms of where those incentives go. So if I can go back to my cobalt example, it's what we've done is basically incentivize manufacturing or investment in the United States. And I'm all in favor of that. I want to help our economy. I want people to have jobs in the United States. But sometimes there's a public interest, public policy interest in supporting things that are outside the United States. It might be a South Korean company making solar panels, and it certainly would be that formalized mine site in the Congo. I've talked to American companies that want to do the right thing, and they say if we had some financial incentives, it would make it a heck of a lot easier to do it. So I think we need to be a little bit more ambitious or expansive in how we extend these credits or these tax benefits.
I was thinking that on the social side, that's also one thing holding back, right? Because it may be difficult to have social incentives. But from what you were saying, if it's geographic, perhaps it can have a social impact too.
Exactly.
Thank you.
I would just add that I think the investors that I'm working with see not only the benefit of these incentives and loans and loan guarantees for their own investment, but they're also really looking at how the policy realm, state level policy, federal level policy, and global policy can support their investments. So the investors are stepping out as advocates, saying we need to maintain these kinds of incentives. We need to grow the pot so that more companies can benefit by them. And as Michael just said, we need to make sure that there are good policies that are stable, particularly in emerging markets, so that we can really move there and ensure that these are low risk investments. So they are speaking out more. We saw lots of investors going to the COP and speaking at the COP, saying to the governments, we need you to provide the policy framework into which we can pour our money. So it's a partnership.
Yeah, it takes a village.
Yeah,
We're going to move to
a village
segment
of
4.
big investors.
Right.
Navigating the complexities of sustainable investing is a journey of understanding both its potential and pitfalls. It's a landscape where idealistic environmental, social, and governance objectives often clash with the hard realities of investment outcomes. The gap between aspiration and practical implementation poses a significant challenge. Consider the case of ExxonMobil's proxy campaign, a telling example of the struggle between ethics and profit. This scenario underscores the delicate balancing act required in sustainable investing. Investors often grapple with aligning their moral compass with the pursuit of financial returns, all while steering clear of the perils of greenwashing. Investors are learning that sustainable investing isn't just about the financial bottom line, but also about making a meaningful impact. Despite these hurdles, the transformation towards sustainability in the investment world is not just possible, but increasingly becoming the norm. Learning from both successes and failures, investors are gradually discovering ways to harmonize ethical considerations with profitability, transforming challenges into opportunities for growth and positive change.
Mike, I don't know if you want to speak about ExxonMobil or have another example, but how do you evaluate the effectiveness of shareholder activism in driving ethical and sustainable practices in large corporations?
So this is a bit of a heretical view, but it is our view. We did a report last fall, November, called Making ESG Real, a return to values-driven investing. And what we're proposing basically is it's not for everybody, but there are, and it's certainly not for the public pension funds, the fiduciaries, but there are investors, especially those of means, family offices and the like, maybe some foundations, others, who probably would say, we're willing to sacrifice some percent of returns for actually evaluating in a serious way the effect of companies with regard to environmental or social issues. And we call that a values fund. People buy electric cars that may be more expensive. People buy organics. There is a percentage of our universe, again, mostly more young people of means, women, who care enough about these issues. They should have the opportunity to have a genuine ESG fund that really evaluates the social and environmental risks associated, not just to them as investors, but to people on the planet. Right now, we don't have that. And I'm convinced that if some investment agencies want to go to the trouble of doing it, really getting the data, evaluating what's actually happening in the world, I think there's a pool of people that will go for that. And I think it will begin to change the discussion we're having right now. And to answer your question, I think once that kind of a values fund exists, we're going to see a lot of investors better informed, pushing companies, and companies are going to want to be in that list of the best real ESG values funds.
If that existed, the investor would have to do a lot of that due diligence and research on their own versus just using like an ESG or social responsible database where it's some kind of ranking.
Well, look, I think right now the ratings agencies work with the data they have. It's just insufficient. If you had real data, you could have frameworks where somebody's evaluating just as they do now. They just have a heck of a lot more data to work with. There's something called Pearson's Law, which says that which is measured improves, and that which is measured and made public improves exponentially. Right now, we have very poor social data, let's say about global supply chains, the outsourcing of labor. If you had real data about that, somebody could measure that and measure companies against each other. That wouldn't be a problem. The problem is getting the data and really treating that as a priority.
It's an excellent point. I know that I have clients that it varies, right? I have some clients where ESG is not important to them. I have others that say, I just don't want to buy guns. And then I have others who I think would fit into your category. They would say, I'm willing to sacrifice some performance for the values. Carole?
Now, if I can just add one other thing, I think we can disaggregate the E and the S. Some people really care about climate. There ought to be a fund that really helps them evaluate which companies are doing the best. Others care about diversity in the workplace. There ought to be a fund that looks at that. Others care about the labor, social issues that I'm talking about. There's no reason to have them lumped together when different, as you say, different investors have different interests. We had to accommodate their interests.
And I think, Mike, I can appreciate all the comments that you're making. And I think what you're leading to is a bigger question, which is right now, all investors are relying on stock price as the interpretation of value.
Right.
And, there is the question of the well-being, the overall well-being of the beneficiary. And currently, stock price doesn't take that overall well-being into account. So, there is a challenge of whether stock price is the best measurement for success here, or whether there are other indicators that we should be looking at. And that conversation has been going on, I think, for several decades. I can think back to Beyond GDP, which was a conference that took place in Europe probably back in 2006. But investors are becoming increasingly aware that the value of the portfolio doesn't tell the full story, and they're really willing to start considering these other considerations on their assessment of value.
Yeah. I'd like to jump in and just talk about that Exxon case, because you mentioned it at the outset, Andy. And I think that's a good example of what Carole was just talking about. The share price goes up because fossil fuel is still necessary, but there's a real risk. And I think investors are now recognizing that the risk is not just volatility on the market. The risk is that climate change is going to impact everything we hold. The entire economy is at risk here. We call it systemic risk. So if you hold real estate and sea level rise continues, you're going to lose real estate. If you have insurance in your portfolio and there are critical, catastrophic weather events like we're seeing here in California, atmospheric rivers, this is going to have an impact on that insurance sector that you're holding. So investors are recognizing that you can't just look one company at a time and ask, is it making money for me today? You've got to look at what's the long-term trajectory of the portfolio, and is there a risk from the activities of this company? In the case with Exxon, the biggest institutional investors engaged them for years. I first went with California Controller John Chung to the AGM of Exxon in 2007, and I was not the first. There were many, many investors engaging Exxon for a long time. And Exxon was unwilling to move. When other fossil fuel companies began diversifying and becoming energy companies, Exxon has doubled down and said, we're going to draw the last drop out. And so several years ago, investors came together and said, this company isn't well managed. This company is ignoring the facts. And there was a move to remove directors from the board and replace them with the directors that the investors believed were going to be better positioned to move this company into the future. And we saw that happen. I think the test is still to come. Will Exxon change with these new directors on the board? But certainly investors are paying very close attention to companies like this that can't stay in the past. They've got to move forward. And investors have a long-term view. They're looking at where their portfolio is going to be, not next month, but over the long haul. They're managing for retirement security, and they intend to be in the market for much longer than any of us are going to be around.
Thank you. Let's bring it home and go to segment 5.
As we look into the future of sustainable investing, a transformative landscape emerges, driven by evolving trends and a global shift in investor priorities. Key themes like capital integration and data-driven strategies are reshaping sustainable finance, with new regulations and investor preferences at the helm. A diverse array of sustainable investing approaches is emerging, reflecting the increasing influence of younger investors. Europe is set to lead sustainable investing, while the US experiences a unique blend of politics and environmental, social, and governance considerations. This global dichotomy will significantly impact the direction of sustainable finance. Notably, sustainable funds have outperformed their traditional counterparts, marking a shift towards ESG investments. This trend is a testament to the resilience and growth potential of sustainable investing, highlighting its increasing mainstream appeal. The future of sustainable investing is characterized by a combination of regulatory evolution, changing investor behavior, and impressive performance metrics. This evolving landscape offers both challenges and opportunities, paving the way for a financially sound and environmentally conscious future.
Mike, what emerging trends do you believe will shape the future of ethical investments?
Well, if I can come back to where we started, I'm here in Europe and I'm just seeing the really evolution of European governments and their attention to global environmental, social, human rights issues. There's no doubt that in 10 years, we're going to see a much more regulated financial space. Governments are going to put more resources into evaluating company performance. I'm here in Belfast at a conference looking at polarization and extremism. A lot of discussion about social media companies. We haven't talked about that, but there's a lot of talk here today about how do you regulate Facebook and Google and TikTok. These are companies that have been enormously successful financially. They're driving our economy in the stock market, but they haven't been responsible in the way they operate. And European governments now have begun to regulate in a way that the United States hasn't. It's going to affect those companies, the way they do business. It's going to cause them to have to invest in ways to moderate content, to keep extremist content off the sites. There's a huge amount of interest in Europe in particular, I would say again, in greater regulation, and I think it's going to affect the way we operate. Europeans talk about, somebody in this conversation talked about materiality. The traditional view in the United States is you look at what's financially material, goes back to our security laws. Europeans, again, in the context of regulating, are talking about double materiality, not just financial returns, but what's the effect on society and the environment. That's going to be the trend I see. 10 years from now, we're all going to be talking about double materiality.
Mm-hmm.
And Carole, what innovations or shifts in strategy do you anticipate will drive the next wave of impact investments?
And I think this was a topic that Kristen touched on earlier. You know, all of our portfolios sit on systems for their health and well-being. That's our financial systems, our societal systems. and our environmental systems. And yet, when we turn to our portfolio, we're looking stock by stock. And if you think about the global financial crisis, which was a systemic meltdown, even if you had been smart enough to see that in the United States, mortgage lending was going to lead to a problem, and you decided to take all of banks out of your portfolio and all of real estate out of your portfolio still suffered a 30% loss because the entire system collapsed under the weight of that crisis, affecting all asset classes. So diversification isn't a tool in a system level meltdown. So I think the next wave of innovation is thinking about the health and well-being of the system beyond your portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
So that takes you, companies and investors, into thinking about scenario analysis as you're looking at companies. What does the future hold? How well positioned is this? And under what scenarios will these companies thrive? The second, as you do that scenario analysis, is going to lead you to business model transition. We know ExxonMobil will not be able to continue to do business the way they are now into forever. There is going to come a point that their business model will need to change. And then the third is thinking about the health and well-being of that system. And all three of those are linked together. The scenario analysis leads you to the business model transition, leads you to thinking about the health and well-being of the system. So I think about that as through Sustainable Investing 2.0. We've begun that work at Domini. We've launched a pilot project called our Forest Project. The goal there is to sort of map out, when you're thinking about a systemic issue, how do you do that as an investor in a way that touches on things beyond just the group of companies you have in your portfolio? I have a lot of information on our website available on that. We have a whole section devoted to that. But I think that's the next wave of innovation.
Kirsten, your thoughts on future trends? And then, I don't know, maybe I can ask you, like, how do you envision the role of the Ceres Investor Network evolving to meet new challenges and opportunities?
Yeah. So picking up on a couple things that Michael and Carole raised, I do think there's an interconnectedness, there's an intersectionality of the issues that investors care about. I definitely agree that we're broadening our view of materiality, that investors are no longer looking one stock at a time, but are really beginning to think about systems. So that is definitely a trend. Just a couple of the issues that are emerging: nature, biodiversity, deforestation. Those are issues that are really on the forefront of investors' minds. They're thinking about water and water management. These things are related to climate. They're certainly related to underserved communities and poverty alleviation, but we've got to address them collectively. And so I think investors are thinking about, how do they engage the companies in their portfolios? How do they engage regulators and policymakers in the real economy? And how do they make their own investment choices to reflect those trends? The last thing I would say is, one of the places where I see our investor network really doubling down is, we've got to get the disclosure right. And Michael's right that they're much further ahead in Europe than we are in the US. We started here in the US with, very narrow view of what needed to be disclosed. Companies have to disclose financial risks, but now there's a real recognition that climate is a financial risk and must be disclosed. And there's a growing awareness that our regulation has to catch up with the CSRD. We have the International Sustainability Standards Board really pushing us forward to establish some global norms. And here in California, we've got two new laws signed by Governor Newsom that require disclosure, both of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, so those backward-looking, what are the financial risks, but now also looking forward. What are the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, and what are the trends in those emissions so that investors are going to be better positioned to make decisions about their portfolio? So I think corporate engagement, policy engagement, good disclosure around this full range of issues is definitely the way we're moving. How fast? Will it be fast enough? Will it meet the market demand? I think we started with this question of consumer demand. I think there's a ton of work to do, but I'm excited about working with investors who are committed to doing that hard work.
Well, I want to thank the panelists for joining me for this episode. It was such an engaging and thought-provoking discussion. My takeaways are several. We talked about regulatory bodies and ESG standards. We talked about consumer behavior. We also talked about the financial incentives and sustainable practices. But I think my biggest takeaway is really, like, if you're listening and watching this episode, you really need to take some time to reflect and identify what are your values. What are the things that matter to you? Because it doesn't have to just be ESG. Maybe it's E, maybe it's the S, maybe it's the G. And then once you identify what's important to you, then how do you want to vote with your dollars? How do you want to invest? And things are evolving. So there may not be an investment solution that meets your needs today, but hopefully you can advocate for change and find solutions that will suit you. So I want to thank the panelists for joining me. You can visit them and follow them. I know that Carole Laible is at Domini.com. You can find the Reverend Kirsten Snow Spalding at Ceres.org. And Professor Mike Posner, you can find him at stern.nyu.edu. So thank you, everybody, for watching and tuning in. Appreciate you. I hope to see you next week on Wednesday, February 14th on Valentine's Day. Same time, actually not the same time. We plan to broadcast at 6 p.m., episode 23, where we're discussing navigating financial transitions, life's major milestones. In the meantime, keep what you're doing, keep up doing what you're doing, but do something that scares you, because that's where the magic happens.